Hello and welcome to Brokenomics. Now in this episode I'm going to be talking about Japan. Japan is a proper policy nightmare, so it's probably quite fitting that I'm recording this one not too long after Halloween, because it is a bag of horrors for policymakers. So the reason why it's so terrible from a policymaker's perspective anyway is because it has a very high and persistent level of debt that they are really struggling to inflate away for decades actually. And as we've previously covered in the former Brokenomics of a week or two ago, the whole game at the moment with policymakers is debasement. So I use the term debasement slightly separately from inflation, because even though I consider inflation to be debasement, inflation in the common parlance basically just means that price is going up. It is the symptom at the end of the process of money printing and liquidity injections and government spending and all of those kind of things. So I prefer the term debasement. But the whole game at the moment is that debasement level of the currency in order to manage down the levels of the debt relative to everything else, kind of keep the show on the road. Japan is achieving basically the opposite of debasement. It's achieving it's deflation, it's disinflation, it's prices going in the opposite direction. So effectively, your debts are growing in real term. And well, I mean, it's not just that. Japan also has a whole other series of horrors attached to it. So I mean, it has an old population, and it has a very low birth rate. In fact, Japan seems a remarkably sexless society for some reason, and I'm not just making that up. There's the condom maker Durex does a survey every year on lovemaking around the world, and they persistently find that the Japanese are the least frisky, should we say, for whatever reason. And I don't know why that is, because I think that Japanese girls are very cute indeed, but for whatever reason, Japanese lads seem reticent, or maybe they're working too hard, or whatever it is. But the end result is Japan has a birth rate of about 1.43 per woman, which is basically one of the lowest in the world. It's ranked very near the bottom. The net result of that is that they've got a population of about 126 million, and it's going to dwindle down to probably something like 88 million by 2065. So that's not good. I mean, the Japanese, we refer to boomers obviously as old people based on the baby boom that occurred after the Second World War. The Japanese boom, they had a boom, but it wasn't with the boomers. It was kind of more what we call the silent generation. It was shifted back, another sort of 10, 15 years. So as a result, Japan has one of the oldest populations in the world, and indeed a significant proportion of the population at this point has has an age over 65. An interesting snippet on that is that Japan actually sells more adult nappies. For those of you who are American diapers, it sells more adult diapers than it sells baby diapers. So yes, that's not that's less than ideal. And the absolute worst thing is that these old Japanese people are healthy. So basically they're going to stick around for a long time not working. So, Japan has very high life expectancy, and that's down to them having basically a good diet, a high proportion of protein, meat, fish, that sort of thing, and very little by the way of carbs, sugar, corn syrup, all of those things. So basically, and they've got a good healthcare system, because obviously, sophisticated modern first world country, combined with a good diet, a culture of exercise, and what you're basically left with is a disaster from the policymaker point of view, which is you're going to have people retire and then not pay much tax for a long time. Rates of heart disease are incredibly low. A whole bunch of cancers are basically sort of non-existent in the Japanese culture. These guys, they really need to break out those corn syrups and sugars and seed oils if they're going to address their problems. because what we do in the West is we basically fill our people up with, carbs and sugar, basically cheap food that gives you a lot of energy, and it makes you feel that that a family is very affordable from a food perspective, because of course you can stuff yourself silly on a relatively small amount of food, and it has the added benefit that it provokes a high rate of cancer and heart disease, so that basically you get to the end of your working age and then you drop off quite quickly. That's what a sensible country does with good policy making, but Japan is not doing any of those things. In fact, just to demonstrate the point of how bad it is, when I started filming this, I immediately sent Connor down the airport to go and have a look at Japan himself, and then come back at the end of this and tell us if it is as bad as I think you will agree that it is going to be. Right, it gets even worse in Japan. Japan is virtually an ethnostate. I mean, it's not officially an ethnostate. It's not in their constitution, but it mostly is. I mean, their population is very largely ethnically Japanese. They do have some other groups in there. That they give them a name. I can't remember how to pronounce it, but a Nayu or Raikuyen or something like that. There's referring to their Korean and Chinese population that they have living there. Now, when I say that they regard these people as foreigners, I mean these are people who have, say, for example, Korean background. They speak only Japanese. They've only ever lived in Japanese, and yet they are still referred to as foreigners, as Koreans or whatever they are, even though they are, like I say, basically effectively entirely Japanese from at least a Western perspective. But Japanese culture is very, very homogeneous in its outlook and so on. Their language and culture they keep deeply ingrained, I understand. I mean, Connor will come back in a minute and tell us what he found. But yeah, a strong sense of national identity. And of course, they're an island nation as well, a bit like Britain is. I mean, not that we have any of these outlooks, but we could have, I suppose. They've got a strict immigration policy. They do have a visa program. It was one of the things that Abe brought in, and we'll come to Shinzo Abe later on. But there is a visa program that they've established in more recent decades, and they do have a guest worker program. But in terms of long-term moving to Japan, it is very restricted. Strong national identity, strong sense of social cohesion. So I mean, how horrifying is this? As well as having a healthy population that lives for a long time, they're also not doing the immigration, which is which is obviously a mess. That combined with the low birth rate, and you can see the problem that they're getting into. They can't just do the line go up policies that the West does. Now, of course, the West has a bit of a demographic issue as well. So how do we solve that problem in the West? Well, we offer good tax breaks for incentivizing marriage. We respect the family. We make sure that housing is affordable for young people. No, sorry, I'm joking. We don't do any of those things. No, we just basically use the police to bully and harass anyone who questions the levels of mass immigration. But yes, so yes, different approaches being taken. Basically, Japan is breaking all of the rules that the policymakers set out, which is debase, immigrate, and stuff your population with cheap carbs and sugars and kill them off before they get expensive. Japan is doing none of those things. So they're going against the agenda on all of these levels. How did they get into such a mess? Why has it gone so catastrophically wrong for them? Well, it all basically started with the Second World War. Spoiler alert, they lost. And basically a process happened which, as a result, has led to a Japan which has basically remained flat the best part of, 30 years at this point? Give you an example. In 1994, the GDP of Japan was 4.9 trillion. Today, it is about 4.9 trillion. So basically, they've been flat for all of this time. Why do I go back to the Second World War? I mean, it's an obvious place. to start a bit of an economic picture. So I'm going to go back there. I mean, of course, there were going to be a bunch of causes that potentially extend beyond that. But right, so US won, and following the Second World War, the Allies didn't want to make the same set of mistakes that they had made with the First World War. What am I referring to? After the First World War, the Allies were basically vindictive towards the countries that they had beaten. And what it basically did is it led to a significant amount of resentment and antagonism, and ultimately it led to the despotic figures that we remember from the mid 20th century and some of the bad things that they did. So Second World War ended, and they didn't want to repeat the mistakes. In fact, what they wanted to do is they wanted to build Japan and Germany and other nations up. They wanted to build them up. Now, obviously, in Europe, we had the Marshall Plan, which was a program of assistance to Europe. We didn't exactly have the Marshall Plan in Japan, but we had something very similar. So Japan was stabilized for a long while. There's lots of rebuilding of infrastructure, lots of stabilization for the economy, lots of laying the groundwork for future growth. And it was all done under the supervision of General Douglas MacArthur, who was the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers out there in the Asian theatre. And they adopted a new constitution in 1947 that established democratic government, stripped the emperor of political power. It promoted, civil liberties, all those sort of things. Now, whether those are key or not, one of the key things it did do is it did have a whole bunch of societal reforms. Now, these were things like land reforms, which basically took these vast land holdings of large landlords and redistributed that to tenant farmers. So basically creating a significant middle class. And by breaking large static systems into a whole bunch of smaller tenanted farmers, what you do is you incentivize innovation and productivity gains. I mean, it's like the opposite of the Brokenomics that Josh and I did with the USSR, where they collectivized everything. In Japan, it was exactly the opposite. They broke everything up, leading to innovation and incentives to invest and educate and all those kind of things. The US also guided Japan in adopting a whole bunch of economic policies that would stimulate growth. So, I mean, they did a bit of work about stabilizing the currency, which was, probably actually necessary given that there'd just been a war. Promote industrialization, encourage trade. The Americans, they gave them security arrangements. So this was basically a US-Japan security treaty, and that was signed in 1951, I believe it was. It got revised later, about 10 years later. And that basically allowed a whole bunch of US military bases in Japan, and the US committed to defend Japan in the case of an attack. Now, of course, what that meant is that Japan could then focus pretty much exclusively on their economic recovery, and they didn't need to waste any money on weapon systems and national defense and all that kind of stuff, because that was being covered by the Americans. There was also a whole bunch of technology and knowledge transfers. So the US facilitated the transfer of technology, which was largely, electrical systems, to Japan to help it modernize and improve its productivity. The US gave it access to markets, basically by cooperating with it in a whole series of trade deals. And of course, because it had been for a devastating war, and it's got this whole process of reforms going in place, what that is basically doing is sweeping away the established structure that they had up until that point, kind of resetting things and giving people an opportunity to adapt themselves to the realities of where they currently were. I won't give an economic example of this, but you can see the opposite of this in something like the democratic politics in the US, where basically the Democrat Party is completely consumed and controlled, and actually to a large extent the Republican Party as well, by people in their 80s in this sort of gerontocracy. When you establish these structures that aren't open to change and have become calcified, innovation completely goes out the window. And as you know, I'm all about innovation. What Japan had after the war is a sweeping away of the capital structure, a stripping away of the political system, a dispersal of powers, an injection of new technology, new ways of working, and basically kind of reset it and allowed it to adapt to the current age, as opposed to, let's say Japan of the 1950s would have otherwise been controlled by people who had come up in the 20s and 30s and still thought was along the lines of a previous generation. So essentially, it was I don't want to say a great reset. It was a bit of a fresh start. Let's call it a fresh start. And also, of course, it just so happened that and I don't know why this is actually. So comment in the comments if you understand why this happened, but or what it is the Japanese that makes this true. But the Japanese seem extraordinarily well suited to electrical engineering, and this was really the decades of electrical engineering. Funnily enough, it doesn't seem to be the case with software. So the Japanese basically had a very strong 60s, 70s, and 80s when electrical engineering was the forefront of technology. Obviously, since the later 90s, the 2000s and 2010s, it's been all about software. And for whatever reason, I don't understand why, but for whatever reason, the Japanese do not seem as well adapted to innovating at the forefront of technology as they do at electricals. But very happy to read the comments if anyone can explain to me why that is. Another factor during this period is that they didn't exactly embrace full-on free market economics. Well, I say that. The West claims to do the whole free market economics thing. It does it in practice because it has central banks and they control the money flow, and therefore we basically centrally plan half of the transaction, the money half of this. Japan kind of embraced the situation. If you remember in a previous episode, I was talking about how you allocate capital effectively. And if you are going to have a central bank system, I cited the work of, I think it was Professor Richard Werner, who was basically saying, if you're going to do this central bank system, you need to allocate the money that you're creating to productive uses, because otherwise you will get that inflation that comes through, that sort of that rise of prices that come through. Japan actually applied this. So they had something called window guidance. And that was effectively where the central bank allocated cheap money to industries that they felt needed it. So it is central planning, but once you've got central banks, I mean, you might as well embrace it. You might as well do it right. And so basically the central bank gave the banks in Japan a quota for the amount of loans that they had to make to strategically important businesses. So you would be able to read in a paper that the quota was, this much for steel, this much for rubber, this much for shipping, this much for, electrics, whatever it was. But they basically set this level where the money had to be applied correctly to, I say correctly, according to the plan that the central bank came up with, which differs, as we talked about in the previous episode, to the way that we do it here, which is basically we starve small businesses of capital. We make the capital only available to large businesses. The money that is available to smaller lenders, the households, kind of has to go on consumption. It has to go on. We want you to spend it on buying a house or a car or doing a extension on your house, all that kind of stuff. So we kind of apply. We're trying to do this debasement, but by pumping it into asset bubbles. That's the effective outcome of what we had. So the Japanese, at least, they are doing central planning of a sort, but at least they're trying to make an effort to make it right. And obviously it worked. Japan had tremendous growth. I mean, really tremendous growth. I mean, in the 1960s, they were growing at 10% a year. Averaging out 10% a year anyway. That's an astonishing level of growth. If you grow at 10% a year, basically you double the economy in just 7 years. And they were rapidly growing the economy over that period. The other thing they could do on borrowing, I should mention, is if you had a good idea, you could actually just go to the government and borrow money directly from them, and they would. I mean, it's part of the story of Sony and a whole bunch of the other big Japanese names that we think of today. A lot of them, they just went to the government and said, "Look, I think I can do this. I think the Western markets will buy this from us. Give me some money and I'll set it up." And that's the story behind a lot of the big electrical companies out of Japan. Now, actually, by 1985, this success had really started being noticed. I mean, Japan was starting to be thought of as possibly the next world power. There was a lot of talk about Japan overtaking the US, which, to be honest, would be difficult to do because Japan was, a population of a bit over 100 million, and US was a bit over 300 million. So it would have been optimistic to think that, but okay, nevertheless, there was that thinking. And the US started to become very concerned. Now, this is kind of the moment of inflection here. This is where it all starts to go a bit wrong, right? So the Americans start to get concerned about the progress of the Japanese. And in 1985, they basically get everybody together and they say, look, the dollar is too weak against a whole bunch of other currencies, European currencies and the yen. But mainly it was the yen that they were worried about. And we want the dollar to be stronger and the yen and these other currencies to be weaker. So they agreed to Plaza Accords, 1985. And basically the Japanese and a whole bunch of other countries, they agreed to sell their dollar reserves, which made the dollar cheaper and the currency selling the reserves, in this case the yen, go up. Why the Japanese agreed to this, it is, I got to say, rather unclear to me. I don't think any country would agree to this today, but I suppose the US still had a high level of influence over Japan. I mean, they still had a huge number of military bases there. The Japanese maybe felt that they owed the Americans, whatever it was, they agreed to this deal. And yeah, dutifully, the dollar starts to rise and the yen starts to fall. Now, this is good for Japanese exporters, of course, because it's very bad for Japanese exporters, but it's good for Japanese consumers, because now Japanese consumers are getting cheaper goods coming in from abroad, while the Japanese exporters are struggling to sell those goods in other countries. Now, the yen starts to rise, and the Bank of Japan tries to ameliorate this with lower interest rates. So what you've got is these increasingly low interest rates combined with a genuine economic surge that the Japanese have been experiencing for time. It was starting to get quite spicy at this point, the level of success that they were having. And basically what that does is it tips you into bubble territory, where, and this is always the case with bubbles, they always start with something genuine, and then you apply debt, leverage, or excess liquidity. I mean, that's basically what bubbles are. It's a genuine thing with silly money thrown at it. So that happened, and then by the time you're in the 80s period with all of this happening, especially the late 80s, full on bubble mania. In fact, I mean, it did get a bit silly. I mean, for example, the Japanese stock market peaked in the late 80s, and it has never got back to the same level. Even now, right? Even now, after all of the money printing and liquidity that we've had in the world, it has never beaten its late 80s. Its late 80s peak. Sorry, excuse me. So the Nikkei became, the Japanese stock market, the Nikkei became hugely overvalued. And the other thing that it went into was real estate. That really got pumped up. So at one point, and this is the famous example that everybody uses, is that the little, in Tokyo, they got like the Imperial Palace, but it's not just a palace, it's like it's like 3.5 square kilometers of land with a parkish type thing with a palace and a couple of palace type things in the middle. Anyway, the Imperial Palace of Japan in the late 80s was worth more than all of the real estate in California. That one complex worth more than all of the real estate in all of California. Now, I mean, I kind of get it. I wouldn't want to live in California either, but all the same, that is it's probably a bit nuts. That's probably a bit over the top. Anyway, they did get a bit of pushback from America. I mean, beyond the Plaza Accords. I mean, these concerns started to grow. There's a couple of things. I mean, one was a Japanese firm sold basically components to the Soviets for their submarine program that made the submarines harder to detect and therefore potentially putting American lives at risk. And the Americans really didn't like that at all, and so that caused some angst. Also, the Americans were basically seeing how they were being outcompeted on every front because, well, I mean, take motorcycles for example. Basically, everyone in the US was just buying Hondas all the time because the motorcycles were so good, and the Americans realized, well, the American politicians, they realized that, things like, well, Harley Davidson was going to go bust. So they started putting really big tariffs on Japanese imports of cars and motorbikes, and the excuse given at the time was to protect Harley Davidson.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.